All right, so Josiah Neely, you are a senior fellow with the R Street Institute focusing on energy policy, and you're in Texas. And I was asking around for somebody who could give me a balanced approach to what has become a highly polemic talking point right now: energy in Texas, blackouts, wind power, all of that stuff. So the first thing I guess I want to just start with is, could you give us an update, like what's happening in Texas right now? If people have been living under a rock and haven't been aware of what's going on the last week, could you just tell us what happened and where it stands right now?
Sure. So on the early hours of Monday morning, there was a lack of adequate generation supply in Texas, and as a result, and we can go into the reasons for that. But as a result, millions of people lost power and electricity. That, as we speak now on Friday afternoon, uh, the generation side of things has been restored. So most people should have power back unless they had some other issue with the transmission or which often happens in blackouts. But most people should have their power back. A lot of people still do not have water, either because of pipes burst when there's freezing, or there are some places where they didn't have electricity for pumping stations or the other stuff. So I personally don't have water at the moment. Uh, that should be coming back. But it was obviously there were many people who were without power for several days. Other people faced kind of like intermittent on and off, and some people lost water or gas as well.
Okay, so going back to when you were like, we can talk about why this happened. Yes, we definitely want to talk about why this happened, because it's definitely become a talking point for well, as many things have for one or another political side. And a lot of conservatives are saying, see, this is why green energy is not reliable. Then the other side is like, you're just politicizing this and everything's fine. Don't look in this direction. What's the responsible, and I guess, as honest as we can possibly, get to the truth of this, even though obviously people will always see things differently depending on the perspective with which they approach it.
Sure. So I should say that there are still some details that we don't know yet, data and other things that will have to come out. But I think we have a decent picture of what happened. And, the Texas grid is optimized around the peak demand that usually happens in the summer, right? There's the period of highest demand. And since electricity can't be stored, you need to be able to produce that much electricity at that time in order to satisfy that demand. And so a lot of things in our grid are set up so that they work really well in the summer. They're not designed to work during very cold temperatures. So, for example, um, we use a lot of natural gas in our system, and in the summer that's fine. But in the winter, natural gas for electricity has to compete with natural gas for home heating. And there's a lot of reports that plants were not able to get access to supplies, and so they had to shut down because of that. Likewise, a lot of our plants are not, they're not completely protected from the elements, the turbines or other sensor components. If it gets really cold, they freeze, and the plant has to shut down uh, because of that. So, and then a third thing that I would mention is there's a lot of power plants periodically have to be shut down for maintenance, right? And they typically schedule this when they think is going to be off periods, right? So a lot of Texas power plants do their scheduled maintenance in the winter, and normally that's fine because normally we've got a lot of spare capacity in the winter in Texas. But here you had not only unusually cold temperatures, but it was a winter storm across all 254 counties of the state, um, and so no one, I think, was really prepared for that, and you ended up in a situation where we had peak levels of demand. People were trying to use summer levels of electricity just to keep their homes warm, but we had about a third of our fleet was offline for various reasons, and so because of that, there was the crash.
So, how much attention do you think should be paid to frozen wind turbines?
I think that certainly there were frozen wind turbines, and I think it does fold into kind of a larger issue that a lot of Texas power plants of all power types are not highly weatherized, and so to the this some of the same reasons why a natural gas plant would fail, because or one of our nuclear units had to go offline because of a frozen sensor. You have the same sorts of issues there with wind. So it's part of the conversation in that sense. Uh, I would say that the difference is um, ERCOT. It when it does its forecasting and planning, it does not count on a lot of wind being available in the system because it's known that wind is an intermittent resource. So they take the total wind capacity that we have in the state, and they apply what's called a capacity factor to it that's really low. So they're only really counting on a little bit of wind being there. Um, so I don't, whereas they are counting on most of the so-called thermal capacity, your natural gas, your coal, and your nuclear, they count on that being there because it's not intermittent. And so when you look at the amount of thermal that was offline and what the projections were, that's kind of where the big hole is. I don't say that because I think that there's anything wrong with the, I think it's a mistake to try and pit different fuel types against each other and say like, oh, it's a problem with natural gas, it's a problem with wind. All of these fuel types are capable of operating in much colder temperatures. We see that there are windmills in Minnesota, there's natural gas in North Dakota. It's just a matter of what we're used to. In the same way that I used to live up north, and when it snowed, snow plows would come out and they would salt the roads to get the ice off. And here, when you have snow and ice, we just because it doesn't happen very often, once every couple decades, we just don't have any system in place to deal with it, and so the roads are horrible forever. It's kind of a parallel situation.
I didn't realize that cold weather would affect like a nuclear operation.
Particular case of the nuclear, there was just a sensor to make sure that everything was going all right, and that ended up freezing. And because the sensor was offline, they had to shut down because they couldn't tell if there was another problem. So even when it any plant, um, you know uh, these are complicated pieces of machinery, and even if what the differences between them, there's also commonalities between all the plants in terms of monitoring and the actual turbine generation and whatnot. So yeah, all of them have components that can be vulnerable to extreme temperatures.
If I'm understanding correctly, it sounds a little bit like there there is there is an issue maybe with um the grid itself, but is there also a management issue? In other words, like should we be looking to the agencies that are scheduling and planning and
Yeah.
regulating and that kind of thing? Is that not getting enough attention?
The way I would put it is there are a lot of things that you would want to look into, right? So ERCOT has, they do forecasts of what they expect to happen going forward. And, they had in their winter forecast a worst case scenario for outages. And it turned out that what happened was twice as bad as their worst case scenario, right? And some of that I think is because, people do a lot of these forecasts based on what's happened in the past. So if something is worse than the past, they're not expecting that. But there may, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people talking about, well, why did they even if they were originally going to do these scheduled maintenances, could they not have called some of those off when they saw that the storm was coming? There's certainly other issues with the way some of the cities handled the blackouts, where you're supposed to do, where I live in Austin, um, the they had a plan, which was they were going to do rolling blackouts where each location is off for 40 minutes and then you move on to somewhere else. They started that process and for various reasons realized they couldn't continue it. And so you ended up with 40% of the city was off for 2 days while other locations were never shut off. And that was something that was not really communicated to people ahead of time. That's something you would want to look at. And there, there are a lot of other things like with the generators themselves. Everybody, I think, all across the system kind of got caught flat-footed in this. I don't think that there's anyone who, if they had known what that there was an event going to be like a weather event like this, that they wouldn't have, altered their behavior and been better prepared. But to what extent people could have done better and how you could like change things in order to make sure that that doesn't happen again. I think there's a lot of things that you would want to look at to see, okay, what exactly were the fail points. The big issue is, you when you have a kind of what they call a tail event, something that is uh, seemingly unlikely, it's unexpected, it's much worse than whatever you planned for. You plan for X, but it's actually 2X or 3X. That puts a lot of stress on the system. Whether it's the electric grid or the financial system. And back in 2008, you have things like this, and then you have to think like, okay, what can you do, not only to deal with this particular situation, right? Because that's probably unlikely to recur in the exact way. But what do you do just in general to make the grid more resilient? Those are some things that I think where the conversation should be focused.
Why do you think that this issue in particular took the tone that it did, whether it was cable news outlets or people on social media? Like what do you think about why this became so polarizing politically?
I guess two things. One is that there's a lot of like people are really upset about this for good reasons, and so they're looking for someone to blame, right? When you have a big crisis or disaster, people look for someone to blame, and just in general, for a while now, energy has become weirdly politically polarized, where a lot of people think that wind and solar, that's liberal energy, and maybe coal and nuclear is conservative energy or whatever. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. There are maybe historical reasons why that's true, but there's nothing about the energy types themselves. But it's also the case, I think, that our political culture is so polarized that it's almost like whatever happens, people have to kind of like divide into two teams. We saw that, I think, with the pandemic. We've seen it with a bunch of stuff where things that shouldn't necessarily be a left-right issue somehow become a left-right issue. I don't think that's good, but that's kind of a trend that we've seen.
Anything else, Josiah, that I didn't ask about that you think people would benefit from knowing about the situation?
I think one thing that just in general, I would say that I am telling people, and this is more of a personal thing than a kind of like society-wide thing, is I think, and we've seen this a couple of different times in the last year. It's good to be it's good to be prepared for all sorts of unusual circumstances, right? You need, a lot of people, I think, it's recommended that you have a certain amount of supply of water and food in your house in case of a disaster, and a lot of people don't do that. It's understandable why that is, but certainly if you have that cushion, an event like this becomes a lot more manageable if you're able to do that. And if if you've thought ahead of, okay, well, what would we do if we did not have power for a couple of days, right? How would we manage that? I think that is something that is useful for people to be, reflective upon and kind of prepared for whatever the next thing is, whether it's a hurricane, or a heat wave or a snowstorm or whatever.
And I can put some links in the description of this video for people if they want more resources on all of that stuff. So, Josiah Neely, thank you. And I will have the link also to your think tank if people want to
Yes.
follow the blog there, or write you and say, wait a second, what about this? No, you could just read the comment section.
Great.
Hey, yeah, if you want to warm up by the fire, just read my comment section. That's all you have to do. There's plenty of geothermal energy coming out of the comment section. Anyway, yeah. Well, no, I appreciate your time. And do you have power right now? Or did you?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
We have power. We do not have water at the moment. But
yeah, that is the tough part too, man. It's like not just we're out in the middle of nowhere as well. People know that from following the channel, and that's the really tough part when the power goes out too, is the water side of things.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really good reminder that that this kind of stuff can happen, and you don't want to be racing to a grocery store that also has no power or whatever else to get stuff especially if a gazillion other people are doing it at the same time, and people don't think sometimes about, well, what, my credit card's not going to work, do I have cash or other stuff like that. So yeah, it's important. Okay, well, thanks again. I appreciate your taking the time.
Glad to do it.